So my name is Michael Vallis, and I am a psychologist who is focused on obesity management in Canada. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to present this brief presentation under the title, Rethinking Success in Obesity Management. And the real question I think we all have to ask ourselves is what is success? Now, I don't have a long time to present, so I can actually present this entire section in less than 1 minute. So I'd like you to reflect on the following. You actually cannot control the stock market. You might try to manipulate it, but you're at the end of the day going to have to admit that it's not under your control. You actually can't control the weather, despite your plans for a vacation down south that get waylaid by a storm. You actually can't control other people, something that we learn quite quickly in our lives. There's a theme going on here that I think is really important for us to pick up on, because you actually also cannot control your biology, and that's where your weight really fits. Weight fits under biological functions. The only thing that we can control is what we do, our behavior. And that's why I'm grateful as a psychologist to be able to contribute to this major revision to our goals in obesity management. I'd like to suggest to you that at the end of the day, individuals can only impact what they do. And so we really have to shift our focus from outcome to effort and reconsider the kinds of outcomes that we consider to be important. So just consider the following as an example of this quite important point. And I would like to make a very strong parallel around homeostasis between temperature and weight. That is, the body's ability to control your temperature and the body's ability to control your weight. So what happens if the room temperature rises right now to 38 degrees Celsius? You will begin to sweat. What happens if the room temperature drops to minus 10 degrees Celsius? You will shiver. And if I was to ask you, can you stop your body's reactions? You would say, absolutely not. You're shivering to warm up. You're sweating to cool down. This is how you survive. And so we know that weight is exactly the same. This slide is a demonstration from, it's actually quite a useful slide, I think, this study, because it's a very publicly understandable population, which is people who contribute to the Biggest Loser television show. And this is the 2009 season, followed over 6 years. And the two things that are important to understand here is that there was a tremendous amount of weight loss from the beginning to the end of the show. Oh, that's great. People actually went down over 50 kilograms on average. Now, the bad news is 6 years later, they've regained 85% of their weight. So that outcome of weight sounded so good temporarily, but over time, it doesn't really maintain that kind of enthusiasm. But the really scary part about these data is that the metabolic regulation or counter-regulation that occurred. So at the beginning of the season, there was around 2,600 calories per day as sort of their resting metabolic rate, which dropped about 700 calories by the end of the season. 6 years later, it's dropped even further. And so what you have here is weight regain and yet metabolic counter-regulation persisting over that regain period. In other words, for these individuals, their job of achieving healthy weights just becomes harder and harder and harder. So if the focus is on weight, which is beyond biological control, behavioral control rather, and is influenced by so many other non-behavioral factors, then we need an alternative. Here's the world we live in, the kinds of promises that are made to people. These are legitimate, available treatments. By the way, most people who would pursue cool sculpting would not actually look like that picture. A very provocative picture, by the way. One might comment on why those kinds of ads are being used to advertise weight-related outcomes. And there is also this new what sounds kind of like medicalized bulimia, which is the ability to empty a third of your stomach at the end of every meal by going into the bathroom and flushing out your stomach contents into the toilet. Just have one drink from Starbucks. It's no big deal. It's just one drink. How bad can that be? Well, depending on what the choice is, you can see it can be actually pretty challenging. And then, of course, depending on the size. And in the United States, in their cold drinks, they have 4 sizes. The largest size you can see here, Trenta, is actually larger in capacity than the human stomach. So the environment in which we live really challenges behavior. And so the focus on weight becomes very, very difficult when you think about biology on the one hand and the environment on the other. And when we look at behavior, we need to really filter behavior through that environment. And so this is a slide I like to present because it really shows that we actually have two behavioral control systems, two operating systems of the brain. And you can see them illustrated here. In the figure, on the left, in lower quadrant, you see the limbic system, the original operating system, the iOS-1. This is a primitive brain system, and it's on, and it guides our behavior, and it sends emotional, impulsive, immediate type of messages. Then the frontal lobes on the top right, which is the last part of the brain to develop. Not developed in girls until the ages of 23 to 25, not developed in boys till the ages of 27 and 29. And this is the logical brain, the iOS-11. And so we have this struggle constantly. The human condition is this pull between what you want to do and what you should do. And so we really have to harness the tension between those two systems and really support, and this is where I believe the power of the professional comes in, that we can really support individuals in being guided more by their frontal lobes, what is the healthy choices that I should devote myself to, rather than the limbic system types of activities, which is what do I want to do. So in essence, we know the following when you look at this slide. Your frontal lobes are telling you that apples are always better than apple pies, and your limbic system is telling you that apple pies are always better than apples. And so good luck with that. And so the real issue is what's important enough in your life to choose apples over apple pies for. And that requires communication skills from healthcare providers to help people figure out not just what to do, but the drivers of their behavior. And so when we look at obesity management, what are the outcomes that we should replace with from weight? So if we're not going to focus on weight, what do we focus on? And I would say any method to achieve a healthier weight involves some doing on the individual's part. So they have to do something, be it activity, be it eating, be it medication, be it surgery. They're always engaged in some behavior. So we should be measuring those behaviors and understanding how we can actually support those behaviors. We have to look at what I consider to be the bias issues or the psychological aspect. Why are you wanting to lose weight? If I had a nickel as a psychologist in my clinical work, for every time a patient said to me, if only I lost all this weight, everything in my life would be so much better. We know that's not true. Weight changes do not change other aspects of your life. So this is an issue that needs to be addressed that I labeled the bias issue. And if we get changes in that, we'll have positive outcomes. Expectations. Many people start a journey trying to lose weight, trying to control their weight, in which they're asking for outcomes that are beyond any interventions capabilities. They're including surgery, that they're looking for the amount of weight loss and they're looking for a particular shape. So the expectations are key. And then the wanting component, the craving issue. Food is part of every society. Food is an amazingly powerful substance that bonds people together. And so we need to harness that and respect that. And then finally, the thinking component. So these, I think, are alternatives. So rather than just count the numbers on the scale, we could count the behaviors, and we could count self-esteem changes. We could look at how people are becoming satisfied with the results of their efforts, rather than becoming disappointed because they don't look like they had wanted to look. So I'll finish off this presentation by just sort of touching base on each of these issues. And so really the main point I'm trying to say is that we should be measuring behaviors, and in particular the behaviors that line up with the drivers of why people do what they do. And so as a psychologist in obesity, I'd like to say that I am not invested in any specific behavioral pathway. I actually think that research trying to say this diet is better than that diet or this method is better than this method is actually misguided research, because there are so many pathways. Obesity is such a complex phenomenon that there's no way that we're ever going to determine a single pathway to success. What really matters is a pathway that is sustained and fulfilling for the individual. So if the individual is able to endorse and accept and adopt the pathway such that it enhances their sense of self, it's consistent with their values and what they're prepared to work hard to protect, just like your career, just like your life partner, just like your children, then if it's a lifestyle like that, it will be sustained. And so you can see here there are very many pathways. The bias issue is important, and I personally like the following two questions, and I ask them pretty routinely. When you look in the mirror, do you like what you see? Because we know that weight changes that are associated with clinical interventions don't miraculously change what a person sees in the mirror. So the issue of self-image needs to be identified and seen as an outcome. If you can come to accept yourself, I mean, just reflect on your own personal self. And the question I would ask you, which may sound silly, is, do you realize that that body you have is yours? It's always going to be there. And so you're going to have to figure out how to get along with it, because if you don't accept it, then fundamentally you're creating this tension that is really going to become very problematic. Second question, when you walk down the street, can you hold your head up? The bias issues, how do we empower people? How do we help people protect themselves from insensitive treatment that they continue to get in the world they live? So if you can make successful outcomes associated with either of these two issues, I would say that is a very value add. Self-esteem, by the way, cannot be given, cannot be borrowed, cannot be won, cannot be earned, cannot be downloaded. It can only ever be claimed. It's the relationship that a person has with themselves, and they always have the power to shift how they view themselves. And so I think we in the health system can be extremely helpful to people in supporting them in that. Expectations are clearly problematic, primarily because they're unrealistic, and they set up something called learned helplessness. And we've all heard this. I try and I fail. 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 And eventually what do? Well, guess what? I give up. And this is called learned helplessness. And it is a very powerful paradigm. And the challenge is, once a person develops this, they're not likely to start again. So we have to be really careful about success being sustainable. This leads to the doing component. And what we've learned about the doing component is that it's really important for us to start to incorporate the concept of readiness. That how ready is a person to change? Because if we can support the person in addressing that readiness component, as we support them to examine the barriers, and that readiness assessment is a really useful way of kind of doing this. We like to use the traffic light assessment. We interview patients. We ask about their readiness. If the patient and the clinician believe that their patient is ready, well, we just go right into the behavior modification piece. If you're kind of 1 foot in and 1 foot out, we work on behavior, but we also try to draw out the values, the personal, meaningful reasons that a person will tolerate the distress associated with choosing apples over apple pies. And if the person is not ready, we don't send them away. We actually acknowledge that. We get permission to keep the conversation going, to understand what's really going on under the surface. And this is often quite sort of overwhelming for clinicians, often tends to be really valuable for patients in terms of exploring why you're not ready, and then the pathway towards either ambivalence or readiness. The hedonic drive issue is really important for us to become aware of, that food is a passion, eating is a passion, it's social, it's calming. We all have comfort foods. We would all prepare foods as part of our bonding with other people. And so we really have to know how to harness that, how to really to get pleasure, perhaps out of smaller amounts, out of different choices, and really, in some ways I sometimes think that most of us in North America have an attitude towards food that's characterized by more of a gluttonous approach, whereas if we had more of a connoisseur approach, then that could be really very, very helpful. And so we know willpower is limited, and that's why we have to kind of control the environment in order to limit access to food. We know that urges pass, that if you just sit with an urge for a period of time, that it will fade, and that values can override. It's really, the expression we sometimes use is that it hurts so good. Choosing apples over apple pies can hurt so good if you connect it to your values. My final comment is really on the cognition component. A lot of negative, a lot of unhelpful thoughts that come in. Most common are permission thoughts. well, I've worked so hard today, I deserve a treat, or I had a good day yesterday, so I can relax today. I went to the gym last night, so I got some calories that I can spare. And again, these are important things that we can focus on, and there's a number of strategies. We have many, many evidence-based strategies from cognitive behavioral therapies, acceptance and commitment therapies that really encourage us. Within the time that I have, that is my presentation. I hope that I've convinced you that maintaining a selective focus on the numbers on the scale is really not a recommended pathway. The evidence would say that we're actually creating a more of a problem than a solution to doing so. And I think if we look at behaviors, and in particular the doing, the bias, self-esteem, the expectations, wanting, thinking, then there are many, many outcomes in these domains that will actually have a direct impact on health, function, and quality of life. Thank you very much.